Something massive is shifting, and most Americans still don't see it coming. The war drums over Iran are growing louder, but what Washington isn't telling you is that this fight won't look anything like Iraq or Afghanistan. Iran isn't isolated. Iran is backed deeply, structurally, and strategically by both China and Russia. We're not talking about symbolic gestures or diplomatic pleasantries. We're talking about weapons, oil deals, financial systems deliberately built to bypass the dollar, and a military partnership that has been quietly hardening for years while American policymakers were busy congratulating themselves in think tanks. Netanyahu wants this war. There are powerful forces inside Washington that want this war. But Trump, whatever you think of him, is sitting at the edge of a decision that could either cement American credibility or shatter what's left of it. Because here's the brutal truth. If the United States goes into Iran, it doesn't go in against Iran alone. It goes in against a coalition that has been preparing for exactly this moment, and the American people deserve to know that before the first missile is fired. Let's go back to the beginning, because the context here matters more than the headlines. For decades, American foreign policy in the Middle East has operated on a single assumption, that the United States holds overwhelming military and economic superiority, and that any adversary in the region would eventually fold under that pressure. That assumption worked. For a while, it worked in the Gulf War. It partially worked in the early stages of Afghanistan and Iraq. But the world has moved. The chessboard has been rearranged, and the players sitting across from Washington today are not the same players from 1991 or 2003. China and Russia didn't stumble into their relationships with Iran by accident. This is deliberate. This is strategic. Russia and Iran have been deepening military cooperation since at least 2015, when the Syrian conflict exposed how aligned their regional interests truly were. They fought on the same side. They coordinated. They rebuilt Assad's government together. And when the dust settled in Syria, both Moscow and Tehran walked away with a much deeper understanding of how to operate together under American pressure. That experience was a training ground, not just militarily, but diplomatically and logistically. They learned how to sustain operations when Washington was threatening sanctions. They learned how to keep supply lines open. They learned how to withstand the economic warfare that America uses as its first weapon before the bombs start falling. Then came China. Now, China plays a longer game than Russia. China doesn't make noise. China doesn't send dramatic signals. China moves quietly, methodically, and always with economic leverage as its primary instrument. The 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement that China signed with Iran in 2021 wasn't a headline that most Americans ever saw, but it should have been. It represented a commitment of somewhere around $400 billion in Chinese investment into Iranian infrastructure, energy, banking, and telecommunications in exchange for a steady, discounted supply of Iranian oil. Think about what that means in practical terms. It means Iran's economy, which Washington has been strangling with sanctions for years, has a lifeline that doesn't run through any American-controlled financial institution. It means the pressure that the United States has been applying, the pressure that was supposed to bring Tehran to its knee, has been systematically neutralized by Beijing. Every sanction Washington imposed, China found a way to absorb its impact. Every financial restriction, China helped engineer a workaround. The Iranian economy is damaged, yes, but it is not broken. And that distinction is everything when you're trying to understand what a war with Iran would actually look like. Now let's talk about the military picture, because this is where the conversation in Washington gets dangerously shallow. There's a certain kind of thinking inside the Beltway, not inside the Pentagon, inside the State Department, inside the corridors where these decisions actually get made, that reduces military conflict to spreadsheets. How many aircraft carriers do we have? How many strike packages can we deliver in the first 72 hours? What is our missile accuracy rate? And on those narrow metrics, yes, the United States military remains extraordinarily capable. Nobody serious is disputing that. But war is not a spreadsheet. War is a system. And when you look at Iran as a system, not just as a target set, the picture becomes considerably more complicated. Iran has spent the last 20 years preparing specifically for a conflict with the United States or Israel. They didn't sit still after watching what happened to Iraq. They dispersed their military assets. They buried their critical infrastructure underground. They developed one of the most sophisticated ballistic missile arsenals in the entire region, not purchased from someone else, but domestically developed, domestically manufactured, and continually upgraded. They built proxy networks across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen that give them the ability to strike back at American interests and at Israel from multiple directions simultaneously. And those proxies, Hezbollah in particular, have been equipped and trained to a level that most Western analysts were not fully prepared for until the events of recent years began revealing the depth of that capability. So when Netanyahu and the hawks in Washington talk about striking Iran, what they're describing is not a clean surgical operation. What they're describing is the ignition of a regional war that would immediately involve Hezbollah firing into northern Israel, Houthi forces escalating attacks on shipping and potentially on American naval assets in the Red Sea, Iranian-backed militias in Iraq targeting American troops and bases that are still stationed there, and the very real possibility of the Strait of Hormuz being disrupted, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. That's not a military footnote. That's a global economic earthquake. And the American people, who are already stretched thin by inflation and economic anxiety, would feel that earthquake at the gas pump within days. Now, where does Trump fit into all of this? Because Trump is not a simple character in this story. He is genuinely conflicted, and I think that's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. On one hand, Trump has surrounded himself with voices that are deeply aligned with Israeli strategic interests, deeply hostile toward Iran, and fully prepared to push toward military confrontation. On the other hand, Trump campaigned explicitly on ending wars, on bringing troops home, on refusing to spend American blood and treasure on conflicts that don't serve the American people. Those two positions are in direct collision right now, and the pressure on him, from Netanyahu, from certain factions within his own administration, from lobbying interests that are as powerful as anything in Washington, is enormous. What Netanyahu wants is American air power and American political cover to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. What he has wanted for 30 years, and this is not an exaggeration, go back and look at Netanyahu's statements from the 1990s, is for the United States to neutralize Iran as a regional power. Israel does not have the military capacity to do this alone. Their air force, as capable as it is, cannot sustain the kind of extended campaign that would be required to meaningfully degrade Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. They need America. They need American tanker aircraft for aerial refueling. They need American bunker-busting munitions that can penetrate the deep underground facilities where Iran has moved its most sensitive programs. They need American diplomatic protection at the United Nations, and they need American forces standing by if the conflict escalates beyond what Israel can manage alone. That's the ask, and it is an enormous ask. One that carries consequences that would reshape the entire global order. Because here's what doesn't get discussed enough. What happens the morning after? Let's say the strikes go forward. Let's say they are militarily successful in the narrow sense. The facilities are damaged, some are destroyed, the program is set back by a few years. What happens next? Iran does not collapse. Iran does not surrender. The Iranian government, faced with a direct military attack, consolidates domestic support in exactly the way that any government does when its territory is struck by a foreign power. The population rallies. The hardliners who have always argued that America cannot be negotiated with are proven right in the eyes of the Iranian public. And Iran's partners, Russia and China, are now faced with a decision of their own. Do they absorb this? Do they allow the United States and Israel to strike a country they have formal strategic partnerships with, set a precedent that military force can be used to eliminate any nation's nuclear program, and simply move on? Or do they respond, not necessarily with direct military action, but with counter moves that make the world considerably more dangerous and the American strategic position considerably weaker? Russia's response would likely come in Europe. More pressure on Ukraine, more pressure on NATO's eastern flank, a demonstration that American military resources are stretched too thin to sustain multiple simultaneous commitments. China's response would come in the economic domain and potentially in Taiwan. A moment of American distraction is a moment of Chinese opportunity, and Beijing has demonstrated extraordinary patience waiting for exactly the right conditions. The interconnection here is not speculative. These are the logical moves on a geopolitical chessboard where every player understands what the others are watching, and the dollar. We cannot have this conversation honestly without talking about the dollar. The entire architecture of American global power rests on the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. It is what allows the United States to run the deficits it runs, to project the military power it projects, to impose the sanctions it imposes. And that architecture is under deliberate, sustained, coordinated assault. China, Russia, Iran, and an expanding group of nations in the global south have been building alternative payment systems, alternative trade arrangements, and alternative reserve structures specifically designed to reduce dollar dependency. A war in the Middle East, with the chaos, the oil disruption, the economic shock, and the global political realignment it would trigger, it could accelerate that process dramatically. Countries that are currently sitting on the fence that haven't fully committed to moving away from dollar-based systems would have very concrete reasons to move faster. And once that process reaches a certain threshold, it does not reverse. The damage to American economic power would be permanent. This is what Trump is actually sitting with. Not just the question of whether strikes on Iran can be executed successfully, but the question of what kind of world America wakes up in 6 months after those strikes. A world where oil is at $150 a barrel. A world where American troops are taking casualties from multiple directions across the Middle East. A world where China has used the distraction to make moves that cannot be undone. A world where the global coalition that has been quietly building against American financial dominance has found its moment to accelerate. Is that the legacy Trump wants? Is that the outcome he was elected to deliver? The American people did not vote for another Middle Eastern war. They voted for an end to the endless cycle of military adventurism that has drained this country for 2 decades without producing peace, without producing stability, and without serving the genuine national interest. The men and women who would fight this war, the sons and daughters of working Americans, not of the policymakers sitting safely in Washington drawing up strike packages, deserve to have their government ask the hardest questions before the first bomb falls, not after, not when it's too late to turn back. Now, while there is still a choice to be made. The situation with Iran is not simple. It was never simple. But the path being pushed from Tel Aviv and from certain corners of Washington leads somewhere that the American people have not been told about clearly or honestly. And that has to change. The conversation has to be real. The stakes have to be spoken plainly, because what is being considered right now is not a limited strike. It is the opening move of a conflict that could define the next 20 years of American history, and not in a way that ends well for the country that deserves better than to be dragged into another catastrophic war by interests that are not its own.